Increases spectral connectivity. Hold on, you just shared your screen and now I lost your title.
Oh, sorry. Oh, do you see the title on my screen though?
Yeah, on your screen. Serial biases in working memory decrease with structural connectivity decline during healthy aging. All right, go ahead.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity to present this to this audience, and thanks to organizers to put up this great workshop. So it's the first time I present this stuff. It's something that I've been putting together lately, so I'm happy to receive feedback. All right, so let me start. Let's see if it works. Yeah, so let me start by just briefly recapping a debate that is dear to many of us here, especially after these two talks. So what are the neural mechanisms of working memory storage? So is it the brain implements working memory through activity-based mechanism? For example, in this network that I'm showing you here, through recurrent connectivity, this network is able to sustain memory in the form of a bump. So this neuron, for example, has persistent activity even after the stimulus presentation, which would be this shaded area. Or alternatively, at least in theory, these neurons could have a short-term memory, but instead of relying on persistent activity, these neurons could have some sort of short-term plasticity and have memory in fast changes of their synaptic connectivity. So in this case, these neurons are active during the stimulus presentation, and then during the delay period, they are not persistently active, but their synapses are slightly enhanced, which means that they are more likely to fire. So you can reactivate the representation later on. A little plug here. We argue in our latest paper that in fact, these mechanisms are not orthogonal. They cooperate in PFC to support working memory. And more related with the talk today, this is actually the same model. So here on the left, I'm modeling the bump attractor model with short-term plasticity. And to have simulations like the ones on the right, all I did was to remove slightly the external input. So they're, at this point, essentially the same model. Okay, so when you mix these two mechanisms in the classical model, there are a few predictions that come out of it. And for the sake of time, I will focus only on sequential effects. So here I'm simulating two consecutive trials. And you can see that the second trial is slightly attracted towards the location of the previous trial. And that's because, as I told you before, these neurons have short-term plasticity, and so they are more likely to fire, even though they don't show any persistent activity during the ITI. And thus, the bump is attracted towards that location. So this bias that you see here is weak but systematic. So if you plot on the x-axis the distance between these two stimuli, you see that this, and on the y-axis you plot the bias, you see that this bias decreases with the distance between the stimuli. And several people have shown that before us. We and others have shown that this happens in nature. For example, in this paper, we show that it happens in color working memory. But others have shown that this happens in things like weird stuff like face attractiveness or body size estimation. So it's pretty much on virtual every working memory task. So why do I care about this sequential effects, and why do I hope to convince you that you should care too, perhaps? So first of all, as I told you, sequential effects are virtually in every working memory task. So they are likely to reflect the fundamental mechanism of working memory. So it's worth studying it deeper. And more related to the talk today, they are reduced in clinical populations. And at this point, I want to stress that at least intuitively, these sequential effects are not beneficial. So they are basically a bias. So if you reduce this bias, in principle, you would have better performance, right? Regardless, in this paper, other lab has shown that autistic patients have less serodependence in, I think this was auditory working memory. And we have shown that in visual spatial working memory, schizophrenic patients and anti-MDA encephalitis patients also have dramatically reduced serodependence. I don't have time to go into details here. I invite you to read our bioarchive. Instead, I will focus on another population, which is old adults. So old adults also have decreased serodependence. And we found this out in this very nice data set that is available online, CamCan, from the CamCan organization. And they had this massive number of subjects to go into the lab and perform a battery of cognitive tests. Unfortunately, they perform our favorite task, working memory task, in this case, color working memory, and they had to remember 1 to 4 items during a delay of 900 milliseconds And then they had to report on the color wheel that rotated on each trial. And of course, the stimuli are not correlated across trials, so there's no reason to have this serial dependence. And I'm showing you here the beans that I consider the young adults, and this last bean, which are towards the end of their lives, that I consider old adults. But if you compute the serial dependence for each of these beans, you see that the serial dependence decreases gradually throughout their lives. These are different subjects. Sorry, I don't know if I made it clear. Regardless of reducing this bias, they are followed by a worsening of performance. So they make more errors as they get older. Again, intuitively, you would expect that if you remove serial dependence, you would perform better. Okay, so what could be the neural basis of this age-related serial bias decline? That's the question I'm trying to address for now on. For that, I will refer to this very nice paper from the Arnstein lab, where they studied age-related decline in working memory precision, not serial dependence. And what I'm showing you here is neural data from PFC neurons are recorded from monkeys of different ages. And you see that old monkeys have a dramatically reduced persistent tuning during the delay period. This effect, as shown in this paper, it's naturally accounted by the bump attractor model when you decrease recurrent connectivity. So you see that persistent activity is gradually reduced here. Okay, so we wanted to explore this direction in our data and see if this could explain also age-related decline in serial dependence. And so, unfortunately, in this data set, they didn't record any neural activity while the subjects were performing this task. But there is, however, some resting state data. I'm far from being an expert here, but so there is this measure called magnetization transfer ratio, which some people like to see as a proxy of local connectivity. So we are going to explore this as a proxy of this recurrent connectivity. And of course, there is the other typical measures. So our collaborators grouped these measures in regions of interest, for example, brain networks or different tracts. But still, we had like this massive amount of variables that we wanted to correlate with serial dependence. So we use this lasso regression. So briefly, just a regression that regularize your weights that do not explain variability and push them to be zero. So using cross-validation, I found the best penalization term, and this was not zero. So there was an improvement of predicting serial bias by using this penalization. And in particular, all those variables were discarded except for ILF. So ILF, inferior longitudinus fasciculus, is a tract that connects occipital and temporal lobe. And so it connects areas that are known to be involved in working memory, or in particular color working memory, or even color perception. So it's a sensible finding. So let me just summarize briefly what we have so far. So I told you that throughout age, there is a reduction in serial dependence. As you probably expect, throughout age, there is a weakening of this connectivity as well. In fact, we found that for all the tracts that we analyzed. But now we argue that this decrease in serial bias during age is driven by ILF. And to put it clear, I'm just using these partial correlations here. And so what I do here is I regress out all the variability that explain from by age from serial dependence, and then I correlate the residuals with ILF, and you see that there is a significant correlation, but there is not the case when you do the opposite for age. Okay, so let's move towards the final slide. But before that, I will ask what could be the mechanism that underlies this age-related bias disruption through the weakening of this occipital temporal loop. So before that, one should acknowledge that there is evidence for continuous representation of color in areas here, for example, IT, and persistent activity, including for working memory in color for monkeys, for a very nice paper that I invite you to read. And so these are the key ingredients to justify the bump attractor model. So we are going back to our favorite model, and we're going to try to simulate our findings. So as I told you briefly in the beginning of the talk, this microcircuit receives input from what we argue from outside areas. So the way we are going to simulate this disruption of this weakening of feed-forward connectivity towards this area is by reducing this external input. Okay, and so if we do that, we have also a reduction in persistent activity, similarly what has been found in the monkey data. But more interestingly, we are able to, if we generate behavior from many of these trials, we are able to replicate our human behavior. So serial dependence decreases, and it's followed by a worsening of performance on each trial. Okay, so that's it. And before I finish, I want to speculate wildly a little bit. So it's known that ILF is disrupted in schizophrenia and autism, and in particular in working memory contest, as some of these papers. And so I told in the beginning of the talk that we and others have shown that in these populations, there is a disruption of serial dependence. And now we are showing that old adults also have less serial dependence, and there is this link with ILF. So it could be, again, this is completely speculation at this point, it could be that these populations are linked together perhaps through ILF, but it could be interesting to study, but we are in no position to make any conclusion at this point. So thank you. I would take this chance to acknowledge Albert and Heike, who are part of this project too, and actually the whole neuroscience community in Barcelona, which is a thriving community, which some of those people are here in this picture, back when we were allowed to go to bars. Looking forward to do this again. And yeah, happy to take questions if you have some.